You're giving a $200 billion company to someone who started as an intern last year? The boardroom fell silent as executives stared at the documents in disbelief. Just 12 months ago, she walked through those doors as a nervous intern. Today she was being announced as CEO. Robert Chen, the 35-year company veteran who everyone thought would get the position, slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "This is an insult to everyone who's bled for this company," he shouted, his face turning red. "The shareholders will never accept this. This is ridiculous." Within minutes, security escorted him out. But not for the outburst. For something else entirely. As the boardroom doors closed behind him, the new CEO stood up. She was only 24 years old. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, calm, almost too calm for someone her age. What she said next didn't just silence the room. It made half the executives reach for their phones. The other half, they just stared, some with tears in their eyes. Because what happened that day at Sterling and Cross wasn't just a corporate shakeup. It was a reckoning that had been 35 years in the making. So what really happened in that boardroom? And why did a company worth more than most countries trust everything to someone who still had student loans? Let's go back to where it all began.
Every story deserves to be heard. Subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Your voice keeps the past alive.
You're giving a $200 billion company to someone who started as an intern last year? The boardroom fell silent as executives stared at the documents in disbelief. Just 12 months ago, she walked through those doors as a nervous intern. Today she was being announced as CEO. Robert Chen, the 35-year company veteran who everyone thought would get the position, slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "This is an insult to everyone who's bled for this company," he shouted, his face turning red. "The shareholders will never accept this. This is ridiculous." Within minutes, security escorted him out. But not for the outburst. For something else entirely. As the boardroom doors closed behind him, the new CEO stood up. She was only 24 years old. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, calm, almost too calm for someone her age. What she said next didn't just silence the room. It made half the executives reach for their phones. The other half just stared, some with tears in their eyes. Because what happened that day at Sterling and Cross wasn't just a corporate shakeup. It was a reckoning that had been 35 years in the making. My name is Emily Harris, and this is the story of how I went from being the invisible intern to the CEO of one of the most powerful companies in America. But to understand how that boardroom scene happened, you need to know where I came from. You need to know about the choice someone made 30 years ago, a choice that changed everything. I grew up in a small town in Ohio called Millbrook. My mother, Susan Harris, worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. She cleaned offices at night, worked the morning shift at a diner, and did bookkeeping for small businesses in the afternoon. I rarely saw her awake during my childhood. When I did see her, she was exhausted, her hands red and raw from scrubbing floors, her eyes barely able to stay open. But she never complained. Not once. She would come home at 2 in the morning, check on me, kiss my forehead even though she thought I was asleep, and then collapse into bed for 3 hours before starting all over again. I pretended to sleep during those moments, but I was always awake. I would watch her through half-closed eyes, seeing the way her shoulders sagged, the way she moved like every step hurt. I was 8 years old when I first asked her why we didn't have a dad like the other kids. She sat me down at our tiny kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg that we propped up with old magazines, and she told me the truth. She told me that she had been married once, to a man she thought loved her. She told me that when I was born, everything changed. Not because of me, but because of him. She told me that my father had looked at me, at my size, at my appearance, and he had said I wasn't good enough, that I wasn't the daughter he wanted. And he left, just like that. Walked out when I was 3 months old and never looked back. My mother's voice didn't shake when she told me this. She spoke matter-of-factly like she was reciting a grocery list, but I saw the pain in her eyes. The kind of pain that never really heals, it just gets buried deeper. She told me that my father came from a wealthy family. His name was Jonathan Sterling. Yes, that's Sterling. The same Sterling whose name was on the building where I would eventually intern. The same Sterling whose company I would eventually lead. But back then, he was just the man who abandoned us because I wasn't pretty enough, thin enough, perfect enough for his family's image. My mother never asked him for help. She never sued for child support. She never even told anyone in town who my father was. She simply worked herself to the bone to make sure I had food, clothes, and a roof over my head. I learned to be invisible early on. At school, I kept my head down. I didn't make waves. I didn't draw attention to myself. I was overweight, my clothes were old, and my hair was always a mess because my mother didn't have time to help me with it. The other kids noticed. Course they did. Children are cruel in ways that adults have forgotten how to be. They called me names. They laughed at my lunch, which was usually whatever I could throw together myself because my mother was already at work when I woke up. They excluded me from games, from birthday parties, from everything that makes childhood bearable. But I didn't cry. I had learned from my mother that crying didn't change anything. Work did. Perseverance did. Surviving did. So I survived. I threw myself into schoolwork because it was the one thing I could control. I couldn't control what I looked like. I couldn't control what the other kids thought of me. But I could control my grades. I studied at the public library every day after school, sitting in the corner with my books spread out, losing myself in math problems and history lessons. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, noticed me. She was a kind woman in her 60s with gray hair and glasses that always slid down her nose. She never asked questions. She simply made sure I had a quiet place to work and occasionally brought me snacks, granola bars or crackers. Small things that made a big difference when you weren't sure if there would be dinner waiting at home. By the time I was in middle school, I was at the top of my class. By high school, I was valedictorian. My mother came to my graduation, and it was the first time I had seen her cry. She sat in the back row of the auditorium, her eyes red and swollen, watching as I gave my speech about perseverance and hard work and never giving up. I saw her dabbing at her eyes with a worn tissue, and I almost broke down myself. But I didn't. I finished my speech, thanked my mother for everything she had done, and walked off that stage knowing that I had made her proud. College was supposed to be my escape. I had earned a full academic scholarship to Ohio State, and for the first time in my life, I thought things might get easier. They didn't. My mother got sick during my freshman year. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away, then fatigue that made it hard for her to work her usual shifts. She tried to hide it from me, but I could hear it in her voice during our weekly phone calls. She sounded tired, more tired than usual, and she kept making excuses about why she couldn't visit. I came home for Thanksgiving and found her collapsed on the kitchen floor. She had been trying to make dinner, trying to pretend everything was fine, and her body simply gave out. I called 911, rode with her in the ambulance, and sat in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours before a doctor finally came out to talk to me. The doctor was young, probably just a few years older than me, with dark circles under her eyes and a clipboard clutched in her hands. She sat down next to me and told me that my mother had stage 3 lung cancer. She told me that my mother had known for months but hadn't sought treatment because she couldn't afford it and didn't want to burden me. She told me that if we started treatment immediately, my mother might have 2 years. Maybe less. I don't remember much about the rest of that conversation. I remember nodding. I remember the doctor's hand on my shoulder. I remember walking into my mother's hospital room and seeing her hooked up to machines, her face pale and drawn, her eyes closed. She looked so small in that bed, so fragile, like she might disappear if I looked away. I sat beside her and held her hand, and when she woke up, she smiled at me. She actually smiled. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't want you to worry." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't told me, why she had kept this secret, why she always put everyone else before herself. But I didn't. I just squeezed her hand and told her it would be okay. I told her we would figure it out. I lied, because I had no idea how we were going to figure it out. The medical bills were astronomical. Even with insurance, the costs were overwhelming. I had to drop out of college after my sophomore year to work full-time and take care of her. I got a job as a receptionist at a law firm, answering phones and filing paperwork for $12 an hour. It wasn't enough, but it was something. I worked during the day and took care of my mother at night, driving her to chemotherapy appointments, helping her to the bathroom when she was too weak to walk, holding her hair back when the treatments made her sick. I watched her waste away, watched the strong woman who had worked 3 jobs her entire life become a shadow of herself. And through it all, she apologized. She apologized for being sick. She apologized for the cost. She apologized for ruining my future. I told her to stop. I told her that she had given me everything and that this was the least I could do. But the truth was, I was terrified. Terrified that she would die. Terrified that I would be alone. Terrified that all of her sacrifices would have been for nothing. One night, about a year into her treatment, my mother asked me to sit with her. She was having a good day, which meant she could sit up in bed and talk without getting too tired. She held my hand and looked at me with those eyes that had seen too much pain, too much struggle. "Emily, I need to tell you something. I need to tell you about your father." I started to protest, started to tell her that it didn't matter, that I didn't care about the man who had abandoned us, but she shook her head. "You need to know. Because one day you're going to have a choice. And I want you to make it with all the information." She told me that Jonathan Sterling had not just been a man who walked away. He had been the heir to a business empire, groomed from birth to take over Sterling and Cross, one of the largest investment firms in the country. His family had money, power, connections, everything that mattered in their world. When he met my mother, he was in his mid-20s, rebellious and tired of his family's expectations. My mother was working as a waitress at an upscale restaurant where Jonathan often dined with clients. He was charming, attentive, and he made her feel like she mattered. They dated for a year before getting married in a small ceremony that his family refused to attend. They were furious that he had married someone beneath his station, someone without pedigree or connections. But Jonathan didn't care. Least not at first. When my mother got pregnant, things began to change. Jonathan's family pressured him constantly, telling him that this marriage was a mistake, that my mother was holding him back, that he needed to focus on his future with the company. And then I was born. My mother said that Jonathan took one look at me and something shifted in his eyes. I wasn't the beautiful, perfect baby his family had expected. I was chubby, red-faced, and ordinary. In the world Jonathan came from, ordinary wasn't acceptable. His family made their position clear. If Jonathan wanted to remain part of the family, if he wanted his inheritance and his position in the company, he needed to leave us. They would provide a small settlement, enough for my mother to get by, but Jonathan had to walk away completely. No contact, no acknowledgement, no ties to the mistake he had made. And he did. He signed the papers, took the settlement money, and disappeared. My mother never saw him again. She used the settlement to rent a small apartment and support us for the first few years, but it ran out quickly. That's when she started working multiple jobs, doing whatever it took to keep us afloat. She never spoke badly about Jonathan. She never told me any of this growing up because she didn't want me to feel unwanted. She wanted me to believe that I was enough, even if my own father hadn't thought so. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My mother looked at me with tired eyes. "Because Jonathan Sterling died 3 weeks ago." The words hung in the air like a weight. I stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. My father, the man who had abandoned us, who had chosen money and status over his own daughter, was dead. I didn't know how to feel. I had spent my entire life convincing myself that he didn't matter, that I didn't need him. And yet, hearing that he was gone stirred something in me. Not grief, but something else. Something I couldn't name. "There's more," my mother continued. "His family reached out to me last week. They want to meet you." I felt my stomach drop. The Sterling family, the people who had paid my father to abandon me, wanted to meet me. Why? What could they possibly want after all these years? My mother explained that Jonathan had never married again. He had never had other children. He had spent his entire life working for Sterling and Cross, rising through the ranks, and eventually becoming CEO. But as he got older, as his health declined, he began to have regrets. He had tried to reach out to my mother several times over the years, but she had refused to respond. She didn't want his guilt money. She didn't want his apologies. She wanted nothing from him. But now he was gone, and his family was facing a crisis. Jonathan had been the last direct heir. Without him, the company's leadership was in question. His father, the founder of Sterling and Cross, had passed away years ago. His mother was still alive but too old and frail to be involved in business decisions. The board was fighting over who would take control, and the company was on the verge of tearing itself apart. And that's when someone in the family had an idea. What if there was another heir? What if Jonathan's daughter could be brought into the fold? "They want me to work for them?" I asked, incredulous. My mother shook her head. "They want you to prove yourself. They're offering you an internship at Sterling and Cross. If you do well, if you show that you have what it takes, they'll consider bringing you into the family business officially. They'll pay for you to finish your degree. They'll cover my medical expenses. They'll give us everything we've needed." I stared at her, my mind racing. This was the family that had rejected me before I could even speak. This was the family that had paid my father to leave us. And now they wanted me because they needed me. Because I was useful to them. "I don't want their help," I said, my voice hard. "I don't want anything from them." My mother reached out and took my hand. Her grip was weak, her skin papery and thin. "Emily, I'm dying." Her words were blunt, factual. "The treatments aren't working anymore. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. When I'm gone, you'll have nothing. No family. No support. No way to finish school." Tears filled her eyes. "I know these people hurt us. I know they don't deserve you. But this is your chance. Your chance to have the life you should have had all along." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell her that I would rather struggle on my own than take anything from the people who had caused us so much pain. But when I looked at my mother, at the woman who had sacrificed everything for me, I knew I couldn't. She was asking me to do this. Not for them. For her. For the peace of mind that I would be okay after she was gone. So I agreed. I told her I would take the internship. I told her I would go to Sterling and Cross and prove myself. But in my heart I made a different promise. I promised myself that I would make them see what they had thrown away. I would make them regret every choice they had made. And when the time came, I would make them pay. 2 weeks later, I walked through the doors of Sterling and Cross for the first time. The building was massive, glass and steel rising 40 stories into the sky. The lobby was all marble and polished wood, with expensive art on the walls and security guards stationed at every entrance. I felt small standing there in my cheap suit, clutching my bag, trying not to look as out of place as I felt. A woman in her 50s approached me. She was elegant, perfectly dressed, with sharp eyes that took in every detail. "Emily Harris." He nodded. "I'm Margaret Sterling, Jonathan's cousin. Welcome to Sterling and Cross." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She looked at me the same way people had looked at me my entire life, like I was something to be evaluated, judged, and found lacking. But I held her gaze. I had spent my whole life being underestimated. I was used to it. Margaret led me through the building, pointing out conference rooms and executive offices. She explained that I would be working in the acquisitions department, assisting with research and paperwork. It was grunt work, the kind of thing they gave to interns who didn't matter. But I didn't complain. I thanked her politely and got to work. The other interns were young, polished, connected. They came from the right families, went to the right schools, wore the right clothes. They looked at me the same way Margaret had, with thinly veiled disdain. I was the charity case, the girl who didn't belong. But I didn't care. I worked harder than all of them. I stayed late every night, poring over financial reports and market analyses. I learned everything I could about the company, about how it operated, about where its weaknesses were. And I started to notice things that didn't add up. There were transactions that seemed questionable. Patterns that suggested something was very wrong. At first, I thought maybe I was reading too much into it. I was new, inexperienced, maybe I just didn't understand how things worked at this level. But the more I dug, the more inconsistencies I found. Money was moving in ways that didn't make sense. Shell companies were being used to hide losses. Accounts were being manipulated to make the company's financial health look better than it actually was. Someone was cooking the books. And they had been doing it for years. I started keeping notes. I documented everything I found, every suspicious transaction, every irregularity. I kept the files on a personal drive that I carried with me at all times. I didn't trust the company's servers. I didn't trust anyone in that building. I was surrounded by people who had wealth and power and connections, and I was just the intern nobody noticed, which turned out to be my greatest advantage. Because when you're invisible, people talk around you like you're not there. They have conversations they shouldn't have. They make phone calls without lowering their voices. They leave documents on their desks when they go to lunch. And I absorbed it all. I learned who was sleeping with whom, who was angling for promotions, who had gambling debts, who was struggling with divorce. I learned the secrets that people thought they were hiding. And slowly, I began to understand the ecosystem of Sterling and Cross. At the top was the board of directors, a group of old men and women who had been with the company for decades. They met once a month in a conference room on the 40th floor, behind closed doors with security stationed outside. Below them were the senior executives, the people who actually ran the day-to-day operations. And among those executives was Robert Chen. Robert Chen was the chief financial officer, a position he had held for 12 years. He had been with Sterling and Cross for 35 years, working his way up from an entry-level analyst position. Everyone respected him. He was known for his attention to detail, his conservative approach to risk, his unwavering loyalty to the company. He was the person everyone expected would take over as CEO when the time came. He was also the person who was stealing from the company. I didn't have proof at first, just suspicions. But as I dug deeper, the pattern became clear. Robert had access to everything. He controlled the financial reporting. He authorized transactions. He had his hands in every aspect of the company's money. And he had been slowly, methodically, siphoning off funds for over a decade. It was sophisticated. The amounts were small enough that they didn't raise red flags. The transactions were buried in legitimate business expenses. The money was routed through multiple shell companies before ending up in offshore accounts. If you weren't looking for it, you would never see it. But I was looking. And I saw everything. The question was, what was I going to do about it? I was a 23-year-old intern with no credibility and no allies. If I went to Margaret or anyone else in the family with this information, they would dismiss me. Or worse, they would tip off Robert, and he would destroy the evidence and possibly come after me. I needed more than just suspicions and patterns. I needed hard evidence. I needed something that couldn't be denied or explained away. So I kept digging. I came in early and stayed late. I volunteered for the most boring assignments because they gave me access to files that other interns didn't see. I befriended the assistants and secretaries, the people who actually knew what was happening in the company, who saw the emails and memos that executives thought were private. One of those assistants was a woman named Linda Chen. Yes, Chen. Robert's wife. She worked as an executive assistant to one of the senior vice presidents, a quiet woman in her 50s who kept her head down and did her job. I started having lunch with her in the cafeteria. I would sit at her table and make small talk, asking about her day, complaining about the workload, being friendly in a way that didn't seem forced or calculated. Linda was lonely. That much was obvious. She had worked at Sterling and Cross for 20 years, and in all that time she had made very few friends. People knew she was married to Robert, and that made them cautious around her. They didn't want to say the wrong thing, didn't want to risk offending the CFO's wife. So they kept their distance. But I didn't. I treated her like a normal person. I asked about her hobbies, her interests, her life outside of work. And slowly she started to trust me. She started to open up. She told me about her marriage, about how Robert was never home, always working, always stressed. She told me that they used to be happy, but somewhere along the way, things had changed. He had become distant, secretive, paranoid. She didn't know why. She thought maybe he was having an affair. I didn't tell her what I suspected. I just listened. And then one day, Linda made an offhand comment that changed everything. She mentioned that Robert had a storage unit. He rented it years ago and visited it occasionally, always alone, always without explanation. She had asked him about it once, and he had snapped at her, told her it was none of her business. She never brought it up again. But the comment stuck with me. Why would Robert Chen, a wealthy executive with a large house and plenty of space, need a storage unit? What was he keeping there that he didn't want anyone, not even his wife, to see? I knew I had to find out. But I also knew that I couldn't just break into a storage facility. That was illegal, dangerous, and stupid. I needed another approach. So I did what I had been doing since I arrived at Sterling and Cross. I watched, waited, and I planned. 3 months into my internship, Robert took a business trip to Singapore. He would be gone for 10 days, meeting with clients and partners. It was the perfect opportunity. I had befriended Linda enough that she trusted me. I had been to her house once for a small dinner party she hosted for some of the junior staff, a gesture to seem approachable and kind. During that dinner, I had excused myself to use the bathroom and taken a detour through Robert's home office. I didn't have much time, just a few minutes, but it was enough. I found a key ring hanging on a hook inside his desk drawer. One of the keys was labeled with the name of a storage facility and a unit number. I took a photo of it with my phone, memorizing the details, and returned to the dinner party like nothing had happened. Now, with Robert out of the country, I had my chance. I drove to the storage facility on a Saturday morning. It was in a run-down part of town, the kind of place where people kept things they didn't want anyone else to find. I wore plain clothes, a baseball cap, and sunglasses. I looked like just another person accessing their unit. The facility had minimal security. A single camera at the entrance, but no one monitoring it in real time. I used a key I had copied from the photo, praying that it would work. Did. The unit door rolled up with a metallic screech, revealing stacks of boxes inside. My heart pounded as I stepped inside and pulled the door down behind me. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and started going through the boxes. The first few contained old documents, nothing interesting. But then I found it. Box after box of financial records, ledgers, transaction receipts, account statements, all meticulously organized and labeled. This was Robert's insurance policy. His backup records of every illegal transaction he had ever made. He had kept them all, hidden away in this storage unit, probably thinking that if the company ever tried to come after him, he could use these documents as leverage, threaten to expose others, negotiate a deal, protect himself. But what Robert didn't realize was that these documents didn't just incriminate him. They told the whole story. They showed exactly how he had been stealing, how much he had taken, and where the money had gone. This was the evidence I needed. I spent 4 hours in that storage unit, photographing every single document. My phone's storage filled up, so I uploaded the photos to a secure cloud drive and kept going. By the time I was finished, I had thousands of images. A complete record of Robert Chen's crimes. I put everything back exactly as I had found it, rolled down the door and drove away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I had just committed a crime. Breaking and entering. Theft, technically, even though I hadn't taken anything physical. If Robert found out, if anyone found out, I could go to jail. But I also had something that no one else did. I had the truth. And I was going to use it to burn Sterling and Cross to the ground and rebuild it the way it should have been all along. I spent the next 2 weeks going through every single document I had photographed. I cross-referenced transactions, traced money flows, and built a timeline of Robert Chen's embezzlement scheme. It was even worse than I had initially thought. Over the course of 13 years, Robert had stolen nearly $80 million from Sterling and Cross. He had done it slowly, carefully, in amounts small enough that they disappeared into the noise of the company's massive financial operations. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Occasionally a larger sum disguised as a consulting fee or vendor payment. The money had been routed through a network of shell companies, limited liability corporations with generic names registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. From there, it moved to offshore accounts in Switzerland and Singapore. Robert had been methodical, patient, and incredibly smart about it. If I hadn't been looking specifically for this pattern, I never would have found it. But now that I could see the whole picture. And it was devastating. $80 million was a significant amount of money, even for a company the size of Sterling and Cross. But the real damage wasn't just the theft. It was what Robert had done to hide it. He had manipulated financial reports to cover the losses. He had inflated revenue projections to make the company appear more profitable than it actually was. He had hidden liabilities and misrepresented the company's financial health to the board, to the shareholders, to everyone. Sterling and Cross wasn't just being robbed. It was being driven toward collapse, and no one knew it. The question was, what should I do with this information? I was still just an intern. I had no official standing, no credibility. If I went to Margaret Sterling or any other family member, would they even believe me? Or would they think I was making it up, trying to sabotage the company or get attention? Worse, if I went public with this information and it turned out I was wrong, I would destroy my own life. I would be sued into oblivion. I would never work in finance or any professional field again. I would be the girl who made false accusations against a respected executive. But if I did nothing, Sterling and Cross would continue to deteriorate. Robert would keep stealing. And eventually, the whole thing would collapse, taking down thousands of employees and investors with it. I thought about my mother. I thought about the sacrifices she had made, the way she had worked herself to death to give me a chance at a better life. I thought about the people like her, people who invested their retirement savings in companies like Sterling and Cross, trusting that those companies were honest and well managed. I thought about what Jonathan Sterling had taken from me, from my mother, from us. And I realized that this wasn't just about exposing Robert Chen. This was about something bigger. This was about holding people accountable. This was about making sure that the people at the top couldn't just do whatever they wanted without consequences. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to take this to Margaret or the board. I was going to take it to the one person who had the power to do something about it and who had no loyalty to anyone at Sterling and Cross. I was going to take it to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I contacted an SEC investigator through an anonymous tip line. I didn't give my name. I simply provided a summary of what I had found and uploaded a portion of the documents to a secure server. I told them that there was more evidence available and that I would provide it once I knew they were taking the case seriously. 3 days later, I received a response. They wanted to meet. They wanted to see everything I had. They told me that if my information was accurate, this would be one of the largest corporate fraud cases they had pursued in years. We met in a coffee shop 40 miles outside the city. The investigator was a woman in her 40s named Patricia Reeves. She had short gray hair, sharp eyes, and the demeanor of someone who had seen every type of corporate corruption imaginable and was no longer surprised by any of it. I handed her a thumb drive containing copies of all the documents I had photographed. She plugged it into her laptop right there in the coffee shop and started going through the files. Her expression didn't change as she reviewed the documents, but I could see her jaw tightening, her fingers moving faster across the keyboard. After 20 minutes, she looked up at me. "How did you get these?" I had prepared for this question. I told her the truth, that I had found a pattern of irregularities while working as an intern, that I had done some additional research, and that I had discovered the storage unit through publicly available information. I didn't mention breaking in. I didn't mention Linda Chen or the copied key. I framed it as though I had simply stumbled upon evidence that was carelessly hidden. Patricia studied me for a long moment. She knew I wasn't telling her everything, but she also knew that the documents were real. And that was what mattered. "This is enough to open a formal investigation," she said. "We'll need to verify everything, cross-reference it with the company's official records, interview witnesses. It's going to take time. He nodded. How much time? Patricia closed her laptop. Months. Maybe a year. White-collar cases like this are complicated. We need to build an airtight case before we make any moves. Robert Chen has resources, lawyers, connections. If we come at him and we're not absolutely certain, he'll bury us in litigation and walk away clean. I felt a wave of frustration. A year. My mother didn't have a year. She was getting weaker every day. The treatments had stopped working. The doctors had started talking about hospice care, about making her comfortable, about saying goodbye. I wanted Robert Chen to pay now. I wanted him to face consequences immediately. But I understood what Patricia was saying. This had to be done right. What do I do in the meantime? Yes. Patricia leaned forward. You keep doing exactly what you've been doing. You go to work. You act normal. You don't give Robert or anyone else any reason to suspect that something is wrong. And if you find any additional evidence, you bring it to me immediately. Agreed. I went back to Sterling and Cross and continued my internship like nothing had happened. I smiled at Margaret Sterling when she passed me in the hallway. I nodded politely to Robert Chan when he returned from Singapore and stopped by the acquisitions department to check on a project. I sat through meetings and took notes and filed paperwork and pretended that I was just another forgettable intern. But inside, I was counting down the days until the SEC finished their investigation. Until Robert Chen was exposed. Until everyone at Sterling and Cross had to face the truth about what had been happening right under their noses. And then, 4 months into the investigation, my mother died. It happened on a Tuesday morning. I had stayed with her the night before at the hospice facility. She had been mostly unconscious for the past week, the pain medication keeping her in a dreamlike state. But that night she woke up. She opened her eyes and looked at me with a clarity that I hadn't seen in months. "Emily," she whispered. Her voice was so weak I had to lean close to hear her. I took her hand. "I'm here, Mom." She smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "You're going to be okay. You're stronger than you know." Tears streamed down my face. "I don't want you to go." She squeezed my hand, the pressure barely perceptible. "I'm proud of you. No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." Those were the last words she said to me. She closed her eyes and slipped back into unconsciousness. By morning she was gone. I sat with her body for an hour, holding her hand, feeling the warmth fade from her skin. I didn't cry. Couldn't. I felt numb, hollow, like someone had reached inside me and removed something essential. The funeral was small. Just me and a few of her co-workers from the diner, people who had known her in passing but had liked her. Mrs. Patterson from the library came. She hugged me and told me that my mother had been proud of me, that she had talked about my scholarship and my internship every time she came in. I thanked her and stood by the grave as they lowered my mother's casket into the ground. I watched the dirt fall on top of it, burying the woman who had given up everything for me. And I made a promise. I promised that her sacrifices wouldn't be for nothing. I promised that I would finish what I had started. I promised that I would make Sterling and Cross pay for every moment of suffering they had caused us. After the funeral, I went back to work. Margaret Sterling pulled me aside and offered her condolences. She told me that the company would cover the funeral expenses, that it was the least they could do. I thanked her politely, even though I wanted to scream. The least they could do. As if money could ever make up for the years my mother spent working herself to death, while Jonathan Sterling lived in luxury, never once thinking about the daughter he had abandoned. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and went back to my desk. The months dragged on. The SEC investigation continued. Patricia Reeves kept me updated through encrypted messages, telling me that they were making progress, that they had verified most of the documents I had provided, that they were getting ready to move forward. And then, 10 months after I had first contacted the SEC, Patricia called me. "We're ready," she said. "Tomorrow morning, we're executing search warrants at Sterling and Cross and at Robert Chen's home. We're seizing documents, computers, everything. And we're arresting Robert." My heart pounded. Tomorrow. Patricia's voice was firm. Tomorrow. And Emily, you need to be there. You need to be at Sterling and Cross when it happens. I didn't understand. Why? Patricia explained that the SEC had worked with federal prosecutors to build a criminal case against Robert. But they had also uncovered something else during their investigation. They had found evidence that other executives at Sterling and Cross had known about the embezzlement, or at least suspected it, and had done nothing. Margaret Sterling's name was on several emails that suggested she had been aware of financial irregularities, but had chosen not to investigate further. 2 other senior executives had similar connections. The entire leadership of Sterling and Cross was compromised. And that meant the company needed new leadership. Someone who wasn't tainted by the scandal. Someone who could step in and stabilize the situation. Someone like me. The board is going to have an emergency meeting tomorrow afternoon, Patricia said. They're going to need to appoint an interim CEO immediately. And we've made it very clear to them that you're the only person who uncovered this fraud, who brought it to our attention, who can be trusted to lead the company through this crisis. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They're going to make me CEO? Patricia laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. They don't have a choice. If they don't, the SEC will recommend criminal charges against the entire board for negligence and failure to oversee the company's finances. They'll do whatever it takes to avoid that. I hung up the phone and sat in my tiny apartment, the same apartment I had shared with my mother before she died. I looked around at the cheap furniture, the worn carpet, the cracks in the ceiling. Tomorrow everything would change. Tomorrow I would walk into Sterling and Cross not as an intern, but as the person in charge. Tomorrow Robert Chen would be arrested. And tomorrow everyone who had underestimated me, everyone who had looked at me and seen nothing, would have to face the truth. The invisible girl was about to become the most powerful person in the building. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about my mother. I thought about the life she could have had if Jonathan Sterling had been a better man. I thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who was told she wasn't good enough. And I thought about the woman I had become. I wasn't that scared little girl anymore. I wasn't invisible. I was seen. And I was ready. The next morning I arrived at Sterling and Cross at 7 o'clock. The building was quiet. Most employees hadn't arrived yet. I took the elevator to the acquisitions department and sat at my desk, the same desk I had occupied for the past 11 months. I opened my laptop and pretended to work, my eyes on the screen but my mind elsewhere. At 8:15 I saw them arrive. Federal agents in dark suits, dozens of them, flooding into the lobby with badges and documents. Security tried to stop them, but the agents simply showed their warrants and kept moving. Employees started arriving for work and froze in confusion, watching as agents entered conference rooms and executive offices. I stood up and walked toward the executive floor. No one stopped me. Everyone was too distracted by the chaos unfolding around them. I took the elevator to the 40th floor, where the senior executives had their offices. The doors opened, and I stepped into a scene of absolute pandemonium. Agents were everywhere, boxing up documents, seizing computers, photographing everything. Executives stood in the hallway, demanding to know what was happening, threatening to call their lawyers. And in the center of it all was Robert Chen. He stood in front of his office, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. 2 federal agents flanked him, and one of them was reading him his rights. Robert Chen, you are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Robert's eyes darted around the hallway, looking for someone to help him, someone to intervene. His gaze landed on me. For a moment he just stared, his expression confused. He didn't recognize me. I was just another face, another nobody in turn. But then something in his eyes changed. Recognition. Realization. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew that I was the reason this was happening. His face contorted with rage. You, he hissed. You did this. Everyone in the hallway turned to look at me. Margaret Sterling stepped forward, her face a mask of shock and fury. What is he talking about? Emily, what is going on? Before I could answer, Patricia Reeves appeared. She walked up to me and handed me a folder. This is the SEC's full report on the investigation. You'll need it for the board meeting this afternoon. Margaret's eyes widened. Board meeting? What board meeting? Patricia turned to her, her expression cold. The emergency board meeting that's been called for 1 p.m. today. The one where the board will vote on interim leadership while this mess gets sorted out. You should have received the notification an hour ago. Margaret pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. She scrolled through her emails, and I saw her face go even paler. She had received the notification. She just hadn't checked her email yet. Patricia looked at me. I'll see you this afternoon. She walked away, leaving me standing in the hallway surrounded by agents, executives, and one very angry Robert Chen. He lunged toward me, but the agents held him back. You have no idea what you've done, he shouted. You've destroyed this company. You've destroyed everything. I looked at him, this man who had stolen millions, who had lied to everyone, who had put thousands of jobs at risk for his own greed. And I felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just cold, hard resolve. No, I said quietly. You destroyed it. I'm just the one who's going to fix it. They led him away in handcuffs. The last thing I saw was his face, twisted with hatred, as the elevator doors closed. The rest of the morning was a blur. Employees gathered in clusters, whispering, speculating, panicking. Rumors spread like wildfire. Robert Chen arrested. The SEC seizing documents. Financial fraud. Embezzlement. The company was in chaos. I went back to my desk and waited. At noon, Margaret Sterling appeared. She looked 10 years older than she had that morning. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged. She walked over to me, and for a moment I thought she might yell, might accuse me, might demand answers. But instead she just said, "The board wants to see you. 1 p.m. 40th floor conference room." He nodded. "I'll be there." Margaret stared at me, her eyes searching my face. "Who are you?" It was a good question. 11 months ago I had been nobody. The unwanted daughter. A charity case. The invisible intern. But I wasn't nobody anymore. "I'm Jonathan Sterling's daughter," I said. "And it's time this company remembered that." Margaret turned and walked away without another word. At 1 p.m. I took the elevator to the 40th floor. My heart was pounding, my palms sweating, but I kept my face calm, composed. I had practiced this moment in my head 1,000 times. I knew what I was going to say. I knew what I was going to do. The conference room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A long table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by leather chairs. The board of directors sat around the table, 12 men and women who controlled Sterling and Cross. They looked tired, angry, and afraid. Margaret Sterling sat at the head of the table. She gestured to an empty chair. "Sit." Sat. The room was silent. Everyone stared at me, waiting. Margaret spoke first. "Emily, the board has reviewed the SEC's report. We've been informed that you were the one who discovered the fraud and reported it to the authorities." He nodded. "That's correct." One of the board members, an older man named Howard Blackwell, leaned forward. "Why didn't you come to us first? Why go to the SEC?" I had expected this question. Because I didn't know who I could trust. Robert Chen had been with this company for 35 years. He was the CFO. He had access to everything. If he was stealing and no one noticed, that meant either the oversight was incompetent, or people knew and didn't care. Howard's face flushed. "That's a serious accusation." I pulled out my folder and opened it. Inside were copies of emails, memos, documents that the SEC had uncovered during their investigation. I slid them across the table. These are emails between Robert Chen and Margaret Sterling. In them, Margaret expresses concern about certain financial discrepancies. Robert reassures her that everything is fine, that the discrepancies are just accounting errors. Margaret accepts his explanation and doesn't investigate further. Margaret's face went white. I didn't know. I trusted him. I looked at her. That's the problem. You trusted him without verifying. You had concerns, and instead of following up, you let them go. That's negligence. Another board member, a woman named Diane Cortez, spoke up. So what do you suggest we do? The company is in crisis. We need leadership. We need someone who can stabilize the situation and reassure investors. I took a deep breath. This was the moment. I suggest you appoint me as interim CEO. The room erupted. Board members shouted over each other, demanding to know if I was serious, if I understood what I was asking, if I had any idea what it took to run a company like Sterling and Cross. I waited for the noise to die down. When it finally did, I spoke again, my voice calm and steady. I know what you're thinking. I'm 24 years old. I've been with this company for less than a year. I have no executive experience. But I'm also the only person in this room who isn't tainted by this scandal. I looked around the table, meeting each board member's eyes. Every single one of you was here while Robert Chen was stealing. Every single one of you failed to notice. Every single one of you is going to be questioned by the SEC and possibly face charges for negligence. But not me. I'm the one who found the fraud. I'm the one who reported it. I'm the one the SEC trusts. Howard Blackwell slammed his hand on the table. This is absurd. You're an intern. You have no qualifications. I pulled out another document and slid it across the table. This is a letter from the SEC. In it, they strongly recommend that Sterling and Cross appoint someone with no prior connection to the fraud to lead the company during the investigation. They specifically mention me as the ideal candidate. Howard grabbed the letter and read it, his face growing redder with each word. This is blackmail. I shook my head. This is reality. You can appoint me, stabilize the company, and show the world that Sterling and Cross is taking this seriously. Or you can appoint someone else, someone with connections to the old regime, and watch as the SEC tears this company apart piece by piece. Diane Cortez spoke again, her voice quieter. And what makes you think you can actually do this job? I looked at her. Because I've spent the last 11 months learning everything about this company. I know how it operates. I know where the weaknesses are. I know what needs to be fixed. And I'm not afraid to make the hard decisions that need to be made. The room was silent again. The board members exchanged glances, weighing their options. Finally, Margaret Sterling spoke. Her voice was tired, defeated. All in favor of appointing Emily Harris as interim CEO? Hands went up. For abstained. No one voted against. Margaret looked at me. Congratulations. You're now the CEO of Sterling and Cross. I stood up. I should have felt triumphant, victorious. But all I felt was the weight of what I had just taken on. Sterling and Cross was a mess. It would take years to rebuild trust, to fix the damage Robert Chen had done. But I was ready. I had spent my entire life fighting to be seen, to be valued, to be enough. And now I finally was. The first few days as CEO were brutal. I moved into Jonathan Sterling's old office, a massive corner suite with windows overlooking the city. The desk was mahogany, the chairs were leather, and there was a private bathroom with marble countertops. It was the kind of office people spent their entire careers dreaming about. I had earned it in 11 months. But there was no time to appreciate it. Sterling and Cross was hemorrhaging. The stock price had plummeted 20% in 2 days. Investors were panicking. Clients were threatening to pull their accounts. Employees were terrified they would lose their jobs. The media was having a field day, running stories about corruption and fraud and the spectacular fall of a once respected company. I called an all-hands meeting for my second day as CEO. Every employee, from the janitors to the senior vice presidents, gathered in the main auditorium. I stood on the stage and looked out at the sea of faces. They were scared, angry, confused. They wanted answers. I gave them the truth. I told them about Robert Chen's fraud. I told them about the SEC investigation. I told them that the company had been mismanaged for years and that we were facing serious consequences. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't try to spin it. I just laid out the facts. And then I told them what I was going to do about it. First, we're going to cooperate fully with the SEC. We're going to be transparent about what happened and how we're fixing it. Second, we're going to restructure the company. We're going to eliminate redundancies, cut costs, and focus on our core business. Third, we're going to rebuild trust. With our clients, with our investors, with the public. It's going to take time, but we're going to do it. I paused, letting the words sink in. I know you don't know me. I know you have no reason to trust me. But I'm asking you to give me a chance. I didn't ask for this job because I wanted power or prestige. I asked for it because I believe Sterling and Cross can be better than it has been. And I'm going to prove it. The applause was hesitant at first, then grew stronger. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was something. It was a start. Over the next few weeks, I worked 18-hour days. I met with department heads, reviewed financial reports, talked to clients, held press conferences. I fired 3 senior executives who had been complicit in covering up the fraud. I promoted younger employees who had been overlooked for years. I brought in outside consultants to audit every aspect of the company's operations. And slowly, things began to stabilize. The stock price stopped falling. Clients stopped leaving. Employees started to believe that maybe, just maybe, the company could survive this. But not everyone was happy with the changes I was making. There were executives who resented me, who thought I was too young, too inexperienced, too aggressive. They whispered behind my back, questioned my decisions, tried to undermine me at every turn. The most vocal was a senior vice president named Gerald Hicks. He had been with Sterling and Cross for 28 years and had expected to be named CEO when Jonathan Sterling died. Instead, he had watched as a 24-year-old intern took the job. He made his feelings clear in every meeting. He questioned my strategies. He challenged my authority. He made snide comments about my age and inexperience. I tolerated it at first, thinking he would eventually come around. But he didn't. He got worse. One day, 3 months into my tenure as CEO, Gerald walked into my office without knocking. He stood in front of my desk, his arms crossed, his face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You're destroying this company." I looked up from the report I was reading. "Excuse me." Gerald leaned forward, his voice rising. "You're making reckless decisions. You're firing people who have been here for decades. You're bringing in outsiders who don't understand our culture. You're ruining everything we've built." I set down my pen and looked at him calmly. "Gerald, the company you built was a fraud. Robert Chen stole $80 million, and no one noticed. If that's the culture you want to preserve, then yes, I'm destroying it." Gerald's face turned even redder. "You think you're so smart. You think you can just waltz in here and fix everything. But you're just a kid playing dress-up. You don't belong here." I stood up and walked around my desk until I was standing directly in front of him. I was several inches shorter than Gerald, but I didn't back down. "You're right. I don't belong here. I didn't come from money. I didn't go to an Ivy League school. I didn't have connections. But I'm here anyway. And do you know why?" Gerald didn't answer. "Because I earned it. I found the fraud that you and everyone else missed. I saved this company from complete collapse. And I'm rebuilding it into something better than it ever was." I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. "So here's what's going to happen, Gerald. You're going to walk out of my office. You're going to go back to your desk. And you're going to do your job. Or you're going to resign. Those are your only 2 options." Gerald stared at me, his jaw clenched. For a moment I thought he might actually hit me. But then he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. 2 days later, Gerald submitted his resignation. I accepted it without hesitation. The message was clear to everyone else. If you couldn't get on board with the new direction, you were free to leave. Most people chose to stay. They saw that I was serious, that I wasn't going to back down, that I was committed to making Sterling and Cross succeed. And succeed we did. 6 months into my tenure, The stock price had recovered to pre-scandal levels. We had signed 3 major new clients. Employee morale was the highest it had been in years. The media, which had been so eager to tear us down, started running stories about the remarkable turnaround, the young CEO who had saved a failing company. I did interviews with major publications. I spoke at industry conferences. I became the face of Sterling and Cross's recovery. But through it all, I never forgot where I came from. I never forgot my mother. I never forgot the people who had underestimated me, who had looked at me and seen nothing. 1 year after I became CEO, the board called a meeting. I walked into the conference room, expecting another discussion about quarterly results or strategic initiatives. Instead, I found the entire board standing, applauding. Margaret Sterling stepped forward. She looked different than she had a year ago. The hardness in her eyes had softened. The condescension was gone. "Emily, the board has made a decision. We're removing the interim from your title. As of today, you are the permanent CEO of Sterling and Cross." I felt a lump in my throat. This was it. This was what I had been working toward. Not just the title but the recognition. The acknowledgement that I belonged. "There's one more thing," Margaret continued. She handed me a folder. Jonathan Sterling's will was read shortly before he died. In it, he left you something. I opened the folder and found a letter. It was handwritten, the script shaky and uneven. My hands trembled as I read it. "Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And if you're reading this, then you found your way to Sterling and Cross. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for leaving you and your mother. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that I thought about you every day. I thought about the choice I made, and I regretted it every single day of my life." The letter continued. "I was weak. I let my family pressure me into abandoning the people I should have protected. I chose money and status over love. And I paid for it. I spent 35 years building a company, but I never built a family. I never had anyone who truly loved me. I was alone. And I deserved to be." My vision blurred with tears. "I'm leaving you my shares in Sterling and Cross. It's not enough to make up for what I took from you, but it's a start. Use them to build something better than I ever did. Be the person I should have been. I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry. Your father, Jonathan." I looked up at Margaret. My voice was barely a whisper. "He left me his shares." Margaret nodded. 42% of the company. You're now the largest individual shareholder." I sat down, the weight of it all crashing over me. My father, the man who had abandoned me, who had chosen his family's approval over his own daughter, had spent the last years of his life filled with regret. He had tried to make amends in the only way he knew how, by giving me the one thing he valued. The company. It didn't fix anything. It didn't erase the pain or the years of struggle. But it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was an apology. And it was power. I wiped my eyes and stood up. "Thank you, all of you, for giving me this chance." The board members smiled. They shook my hand. They welcomed me, not as an intern or an interim CEO, but as one of them. As I left the conference room, I thought about my mother. I wished she could see this. I wished she could know that her sacrifices hadn't been for nothing, that her daughter had made it. That night, I went to the cemetery where my mother was buried. I stood in front of her grave, the moonlight casting shadows across the headstone. "I did it, Mom," I whispered. "I made them see. I made them pay. And I'm going to make sure this company is everything it should have been." The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment I could almost hear her voice. "I'm proud of you." I closed my eyes and let the tears fall. For the first time in a year I let myself cry. Not from sadness or anger, but from relief. I had made it. I had survived. And I was just getting started. But my story doesn't end with me becoming CEO. That was just the beginning. Because once I had power, once I had control, I realized something important. Sterling and Cross wasn't just a company. It was a symbol. A symbol of everything that was wrong with corporate America. The greed, the corruption, the way powerful people protected each other while ordinary people suffered. And I was in a position to change that. Not just at Sterling and Cross but everywhere. So I started using my platform. I started speaking out about corporate accountability, about executive compensation, about the need for stronger oversight and regulation. I testified before Congress about the fraud at Sterling and Cross and how it could have been prevented. I wrote op-eds in major newspapers calling for reforms. I became a voice for change, and not everyone liked it. I received threats. Anonymous emails telling me to shut up, to stay in my lane, to stop rocking the boat. I had my car vandalized. I had protesters outside the Sterling and Cross building, people who thought I was destroying capitalism or pushing a socialist agenda. But I didn't stop, because I knew what it was like to be powerless. I knew what it was like to watch someone you love suffer because the system was rigged against them. And I wasn't going to let that keep happening. Not if I could do something about it. 2 years into my tenure as CEO, I launched the Sterling Foundation. It was a non-profit organization dedicated to helping people like my mother. People who were working multiple jobs but still couldn't afford healthcare. People who were struggling to make ends meet while CEOs made hundreds of times their salary. The foundation provided financial assistance for medical bills, education, housing. It offered job training and placement services. It partnered with other organizations to advocate for policy changes. And it was funded entirely by Sterling and Cross's profits. I convinced the board to commit 10% of the company's annual profits to the foundation. It was a massive commitment, and not everyone was happy about it. Some board members argued that we had a responsibility to shareholders to maximize profits, not give them away. But I reminded them that shareholders included employees, and that taking care of employees was good for business. I reminded them that companies that invested in their communities saw better long-term returns. And I reminded them that I controlled 42% of the company's shares, and if they didn't like my decision, they were free to resign. They didn't resign. And within a year, the Sterling Foundation had helped over 10,000 people. We paid medical bills for families facing bankruptcy. We provided scholarships for students who couldn't afford college. We helped single mothers find stable housing and good jobs. And with every person we helped, I thought about my mother. I thought about how different her life could have been if someone had helped her. If someone had seen her struggle and said, "You don't have to do this alone." The foundation became my life's work, even more than Sterling and Cross. Yes, I was still running the company. Yes, I was still making strategic decisions and meeting with clients and overseeing operations. But the foundation was where my heart was. It was my way of honoring my mother's memory. My way of making sure her sacrifices meant something. 3 years after becoming CEO, I received an invitation to speak at a conference for women in business. It was being held in Chicago, and the theme was breaking barriers and challenging the status quo. I almost declined. I was busy, and I didn't particularly enjoy public speaking. But then I saw the list of other speakers, and one name caught my eye. Linda Chen. Robert Chen's wife. I hadn't seen Linda since Robert's arrest. She had left Sterling and Cross shortly after, and I had heard she was struggling. Robert had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Their assets had been seized to pay restitution. Linda had been left with nothing. I accepted the invitation. I wanted to see her. I wanted to know how she was doing. The conference was held in a large hotel ballroom. I gave my speech in the morning, talking about my journey from intern to CEO, about the importance of speaking up when you see wrongdoing, about using your power to help others. The audience responded well. They applauded, asked questions, thanked me for my honesty. After my session, I walked through the conference, attending other panels and networking. And then I saw her. Linda was sitting alone in the back of one of the smaller breakout rooms, watching a panel on financial recovery after divorce. She looked older, thinner. Her clothes were simple, inexpensive. She no longer had the polished, put-together appearance she'd had at Sterling and Cross. I sat down next to her. She glanced at me, then did a double-take. "Emily." He nodded. "Hi, Linda." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't know you'd be here. We sat in silence for a moment, the panel continuing in front of us, neither of us really listening. Finally Linda spoke. I'm sorry. For everything. For what Robert did. For not seeing it. I put my hand on hers. Linda, you have nothing to apologize for. You didn't know. She shook her head. I should have known. I should have seen the signs. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the way he was always so stressed. I didn't want to see it. I understood that. It's easier to believe the lie than to face the truth. We left the breakout session and found a quiet corner in the hotel lobby. We sat and talked for 2 hours. Linda told me about her life after Robert's arrest. How she had been ostracized by their friends. How people assumed she must have known, must have been complicit. How she had lost everything, not just the money but her identity, her sense of self. She told me she was working as an administrative assistant at a small law firm now, making barely enough to cover rent on a tiny apartment. She told me she was drowning in debt, trying to pay off legal fees from Robert's trial. And she told me she didn't blame me for what had happened. She knew I had done the right thing. You saved a lot of people, she said quietly. By exposing Robert, you protected so many employees, investors, families. I know that. And I'm grateful. I looked at this woman who had been kind to me when I was nobody, who had treated me like a person when everyone else saw me as just another intern. And I made a decision. Linda, I want to offer you a job. She blinked. What? I pulled out my phone and sent a quick email. The Sterling Foundation needs an operations manager. Someone who can oversee the day-to-day work, manage our programs, coordinate with partner organizations. It's a big job and it pays well. And I think you'd be perfect for it. Linda's eyes widened. Emily, I can't. After everything Robert did, after what happened, I can't work for you. It wouldn't be right. I shook my head. You're not Robert. You're not responsible for his choices. And you deserve a second chance. Linda's face crumpled. She started crying, really crying, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I put my arm around her and let her cry. When she finally calmed down, she looked at me with red, swollen eyes. Why are you doing this? Why are you being kind to me? I thought about my mother. About how she had been judged for my father's choices. About how she had been punished for something that wasn't her fault. Because everyone deserves a chance to rebuild, I said. And because I know what it's like to be judged for something you didn't do. Linda accepted the job. She started at the Sterling Foundation 2 weeks later, and she threw herself into the work with a dedication I had rarely seen. She was good at it, really good. She understood the people we were trying to help because she had become one of them. She knew what it was like to lose everything, to start over from nothing. And that empathy made her invaluable. Over the next year, Linda transformed the Foundation's operations. She streamlined our processes, expanded our reach, and helped us serve twice as many people. She became one of my most trusted colleagues and eventually one of my closest friends. People at Sterling and Cross whispered about it, of course. They thought it was strange that I had hired Robert Chen's ex-wife. They wondered if I was being naive or if I had some ulterior motive. But I didn't care what they thought. I knew Linda's value. And I knew that giving her a second chance was the right thing to do. 4 years into my time as CEO, Sterling and Cross had become one of the most admired companies in America. We were profitable, ethical, and committed to social responsibility. We had been featured in case studies at business schools. I had been named to Forbes' list of most powerful women in business. But I hadn't forgotten where I came from. I hadn't forgotten the people who had underestimated me or the people who had suffered because of corporate greed. So when I received an invitation to return to Millbrook, Ohio, to speak at my old high school's graduation, I accepted immediately. I flew back to the small town where I had grown up, where my mother had worked herself to death, where I had been invisible and overlooked. The high school looked exactly the same. Same brick building, same worn steps. Same auditorium where I had given my valedictorian speech 10 years earlier. I stood backstage, waiting to be introduced, and I felt a wave of emotion. This was where it had all started. This was where I had decided that I was going to be more than what people expected. The principal introduced me, and I walked onto the stage. The auditorium was packed with students, parents, teachers. I looked out at the sea of faces and saw myself in them. The kids who felt invisible. The kids who were struggling. The kids who didn't think they had a future. And I started to speak. I told them my story. Not the sanitized version I gave at business conferences, but the real story. I told them about my mother working 3 jobs. I told them about being bullied for being poor and overweight. I told them about dropping out of college to take care of my dying mother. I told them about the father who abandoned me and the family who rejected me. I told them about walking into Sterling and Cross as an intern, invisible and dismissed. And I told them about finding the fraud, about risking everything to do the right thing, about fighting my way to the top not because I wanted power, but because I wanted to prove that people like us mattered. You're going to face people who underestimate you, I said. People who look at you and see nothing. People who tell you that you're not good enough, not smart enough, not connected enough. And you have 2 choices. You can believe them, or you can prove them wrong. Paused, looking out at the students. I spent my whole life being told I wasn't enough. And I used that. Every time someone dismissed me, every time someone looked past me, I worked harder. I learned more. Became undeniable. And now I run a company worth billions of dollars. Now I help thousands of people every year. Now I have a voice that people listen to. My voice grew stronger. But the most important thing I learned is this. Success isn't about proving yourself to the people who underestimated you. It's about using your success to help others. It's about making sure the next generation doesn't have to fight as hard as you did. It's about building a world where hard work actually matters more than connections, where everyone has a fair shot. The applause started slowly, then built until the entire auditorium was on its feet. Students were crying. Parents were crying. Teachers were crying. I saw Mrs. Patterson, my old librarian, standing in the back, her hands clasped over her heart. After the ceremony, students lined up to talk to me. They asked questions about college, careers, overcoming obstacles. They told me their stories, their struggles, their dreams. And I listened to every single one. I gave them my email address and told them to reach out if they ever needed help or advice. Because I remembered what it was like to feel alone, to feel like no one cared. I wasn't going to let anyone else feel that way if I could help it. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. I stood in front of her grave, just like I had done so many times before. I went back to Millbrook today, Mom, I said quietly. I spoke at the high school. I told them about you. About everything you did for me. About how you sacrificed everything so I could have a chance. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery. I wish you could see what I've built. I wish you could see how many people we're helping. I wish you could know that your sacrifices weren't for nothing. I knelt down and placed my hand on the headstone. But I think you do know. I think wherever you are, you're watching. And I think you're proud. I stayed there until the sun disappeared below the horizon, until the cemetery was dark and quiet. And then I drove back to my hotel, back to the life I had built, back to the work that still needed to be done. Because even though Sterling and Cross was thriving, even though the foundation was helping thousands of people, I knew there was still more to do. There were still people suffering, still people being exploited, still systems that needed to be changed. 5 years into my tenure as CEO, I made another controversial decision. I announced that Sterling and Cross would be implementing a maximum wage ratio. No executive at the company, including me, could earn more than 20 times what the lowest paid employee made. It was a radical policy. Most CEOs made 300 times or more what their lowest paid workers earned. But I didn't care about being like most CEOs. Cared about fairness. The board fought me on it. Shareholders complained. Other CEOs called me naive, said I was destroying shareholder value, said I was setting a dangerous precedent. But I held firm. And when the policy went into effect, something amazing happened. Employee satisfaction skyrocketed. Productivity increased. Turnover dropped to record lows. And Sterling and Cross became even more profitable because our employees were invested in the company's success. They weren't just working for a paycheck. They were working for a company that valued them. Other companies started to take notice. A few brave CEOs began implementing similar policies. The media covered it extensively. I was invited to speak at more conferences, to write more articles, to testify before more congressional committees. I became a figurehead for a new kind of capitalism, one that prioritized people over profits, one that recognized that companies had responsibilities beyond just making money for shareholders. But not everyone was happy about it. I received more threats, more hate mail, more protesters outside the building. One morning, 6 years into my tenure, I arrived at work to find my office had been vandalized. Someone had broken in overnight and spray-painted words across my desk, my walls, my windows. Traitor. Communist. You'll pay. Security was immediately increased. I was assigned a personal bodyguard. The police investigated, but they never found who did it. I refused to be intimidated. I refused to back down. If anything, the vandalism made me more determined. I held a press conference that afternoon and spoke directly to whoever had done it. You can spray paint my office. You can send me threats. You can call me names. But you can't stop what we're building. You can't stop the movement toward fairness and accountability. 'Cause it's not about me anymore. It's about millions of people who are tired of being exploited. And they're not going to be silent anymore. The press conference went viral. People around the country started sharing it, started talking about it. The hashtag not going silent trended on social media for 3 days. And donations to the Sterling Foundation increased by 400% in a single week. People wanted to be part of what we were building. They wanted to believe that change was possible. 7 years into my tenure, I received a phone call that I never expected. It was from Margaret Sterling. We had maintained a professional relationship over the years, but we weren't close. She had stepped down from the board after 3 years, saying she wanted to retire and spend time with her family. But now she was calling me, her voice urgent. Emily, I need to see you. It's important. We met at a small cafe far from Sterling and Cross, far from anywhere we might be recognized. Margaret looked older, her face lined with wrinkles, her hair completely gray. She ordered coffee and didn't touch it. I need to apologize to you, she said finally. I was surprised. For what? Margaret took a deep breath. For everything. For the way I treated you when you first arrived. For dismissing you. For underestimating you. For being part of a system that hurt you and your mother. She looked down at her hands. Jonathan was my cousin. I knew what he did. I knew he had abandoned you and Susan. And I didn't say anything. I didn't reach out. I didn't try to help. Because it was easier to pretend you didn't exist. Her voice cracked. And when you came to Sterling and Cross, I saw you as a threat. I saw you as someone who might expose our family's secrets, who might demand things we didn't want to give. So I treated you like you were nothing. She looked up at me, tears in her eyes. But you weren't nothing. You were everything we should have been. You were honest and hardworking and brave. And you showed all of us what real leadership looks like. I didn't know what to say. Margaret reached across the table and took my hand. I know I can't undo the past. I know I can't give you back the years you lost or bring your mother back. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I had spent so many years being angry at the Sterling family, at everyone who had hurt my mother and me. But sitting there with Margaret, seeing her genuine remorse, I felt that anger start to dissolve. Thank you, I said quietly. That means more than you know. Margaret smiled through her tears. Your mother would be so proud of you. I never met her, but I know she would be. We talked for another hour about the company, about the foundation, about life. And when we left, I felt lighter somehow. Like I had been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there. And it had finally been lifted. 8 years into my tenure as CEO, Sterling and Cross celebrated its 100th anniversary. We held a gala at a hotel in Manhattan, inviting employees, clients, partners, and community members. It was a celebration not just of the company's history, but of its transformation. During the gala, I gave a speech. I talked about where Sterling and Cross had come from and where it was going. I talked about the mistakes that had been made and the lessons we had learned. And I talked about the future we were building together. Sterling and Cross is more than just a company, I said. It's a promise. A promise that we will do business ethically. A promise that we will treat our employees with dignity. A promise that we will use our success to help others. And it's a promise we intend to keep. The applause was thunderous. After the speech, people came up to me one by one. Employees thanked me for creating a workplace where they felt valued. Clients thanked me for running a company they could trust. Community members thanked me for the foundation's work. And Linda Chen, my operations manager and friend, gave me a hug and whispered, "Susan would be so proud." That night, as I stood on the balcony of the hotel looking out at the city, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From a small town in Ohio to the CEO's office. From being invisible to being one of the most recognized business leaders in the country. It hadn't been easy. I had faced betrayal, discrimination, threats, and countless obstacles. But I had also found strength I didn't know I had. I had found allies in unexpected places. And I had found a purpose that went beyond just personal success. I had spent 8 years rebuilding Sterling and Cross. But more importantly, I had spent 8 years proving that business could be a force for good. That companies could be profitable and ethical. That success and integrity didn't have to be mutually exclusive. And I wasn't done yet. 9 years into my tenure as CEO, I received an unexpected visitor at Sterling and Cross. His name was Daniel Harris, and he claimed to be my half-brother. I had security bring him to my office, skeptical and curious. Daniel was in his early 30s, tall with dark hair and eyes that looked eerily familiar. He sat across from my desk and pulled out a folder of documents. Birth certificate, DNA test results, letters. "Our father had an affair 10 years before you were born," Daniel said quietly. "With my mother. She was a secretary at one of his family's other companies. When she got pregnant, the Sterling family paid her off, just like they did with your mother. I grew up not knowing who my father was until my mother told me on her deathbed 3 years ago. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. Another sibling. Another person abandoned by Jonathan Sterling. Another victim of the Sterling family's obsession with image and control. Why are you here?" he asked. Daniel looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Because I read about everything you've done. How you exposed the fraud. How you became CEO. How you've transformed the company. And I want to help." Over the next few weeks, I verified Daniel's story. The DNA test was legitimate. He was indeed my half-brother. And he had a background in corporate law, specializing in ethics and compliance. I offered him a position as general counsel at Sterling and Cross. He accepted. Having Daniel at the company was strange at first. We were family, but we were also strangers. We had to learn about each other while working together, navigating the complexity of our shared history. But Daniel proved to be invaluable. He helped strengthen Sterling and Cross's compliance programs. He worked with me to develop new policies around corporate accountability. And he became one of my most trusted advisors. Together, we continued to push Sterling and Cross forward. We expanded the foundation's reach to international markets. We launched programs to combat climate change and promote sustainable business practices. We partnered with universities to offer scholarships and internships to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. 10 years into my tenure, Fortune magazine named Sterling and Cross the most admired company in America. We had achieved something that many people thought was impossible. We were both highly profitable and deeply ethical. We proved that you didn't have to choose between doing well and doing good. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came on a cold morning in November, 10 years after I had first walked through the doors of Sterling and Cross as an intern. I received a letter from Robert Chen. He was 8 years into his 20-year sentence, incarcerated at a federal prison in Pennsylvania. The letter was handwritten, the writing shaky. Dear Emily, I know I have no right to contact you. I know that what I did was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that I think about what happened every single day. I destroyed my life, my marriage, my reputation. I hurt thousands of people. And for what? Money I never even got to enjoy. I've spent the last 8 years in prison thinking about the choices I made. About the people I hurt. About the company I betrayed. And I've come to realize that my biggest mistake wasn't the stealing. It was the arrogance. I thought I was smarter than everyone else. I thought I deserved more. I thought the rules didn't apply to me. The letter continued. I've watched from prison as you transformed Sterling and Cross. I've read articles about the foundation, about the policies you've implemented, about the lives you've changed. And I've realized something. You did what I never could. You built something real. Something meaningful. Something that actually matters. I'm writing this letter not to ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. I'm writing because I want you to know that what you've done is extraordinary. You took a broken company and made it whole. You took a corrupt system and made it fair. You took pain and turned it into purpose. He ended the letter with a simple statement. Thank you for being better than all of us. Robert Chen. I read the letter 3 times, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Anger at what he had done. Satisfaction that he recognized his mistakes. And something else. Not quite forgiveness but understanding. Robert Chen was a cautionary tale. A reminder of what happens when ambition becomes greed, when intelligence becomes arrogance, when power becomes corruption. But his letter also represented something important. It represented accountability. The willingness to admit wrongdoing, to face consequences, to acknowledge the harm caused. I filed the letter away and returned to work. That same week, I announced my next major initiative. Sterling and Cross would be transitioning to a partial employee ownership model. Over the next 5 years, we would transfer 30% of the company's shares to an employee trust. Every person who worked at Sterling and Cross, from the janitors to the executives, would own a piece of the company. It was another radical move. Shareholders were outraged. Board members resigned in protest. The media questioned whether I was destroying the company's value. But I pushed forward. Because I believed that the people who built the company deserved to share in its success. The transition took 3 years to implement fully. But when it was complete, something remarkable happened. Sterling and Cross's value didn't decrease. It increased. Because employees who owned part of the company worked harder, innovated more, stayed longer. They weren't just working for someone else's profit. They were building their own future. 12 years into my tenure, I started thinking about succession planning. I was 36 years old, still young by CEO standards. But I had learned from Jonathan Sterling's mistake. He had held on to power until he died, and it had nearly destroyed the company. I didn't want to make the same mistake. So I began mentoring a group of younger employees, people who shared my values and vision. People who had proven themselves not through connections or pedigree, but through hard work and integrity. Among them was a young woman named Jasmine Rodriguez. She had started at Sterling and Cross as an analyst 6 years earlier, working her way up to Director of Sustainable Investments. She was brilliant, ethical, and passionate about using business as a force for good. She reminded me of myself when I was younger. I began grooming Jasmine to eventually take over as CEO. I included her in strategic meetings. I had her lead major initiatives. I introduced her to clients and partners. And I watched as she grew into a leader who could carry on the work we had started. 13 years into my tenure, I received devastating news. I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Stage 2, treatable but serious. I underwent surgery and chemotherapy, continuing to work through it all. I didn't want to take time off. I didn't want to show weakness. But Daniel convinced me otherwise. You're not your mother, he said gently. You don't have to sacrifice your health for the company. The company will survive if you take time to heal. He was right. I stepped back from day-to-day operations for 6 months, letting my executive team run things while I focused on recovery. And the company thrived. It was proof that Sterling and Cross was no longer dependent on any single person. It had become an institution, strong and stable, capable of weathering any storm. When I returned to work after my recovery, I felt different, lighter somehow. I had spent my entire adult life fighting to be seen, fighting to succeed, fighting to prove myself. But now I realized I didn't have to fight anymore. I had already won. 14 years into my tenure, on the anniversary of the day I had first walked into Sterling and Cross, I made an announcement. I would be stepping down as CEO in 1 year. I would transition to chairman of the board, maintaining oversight but allowing new leadership to take the company forward. Jasmine Rodriguez would become the next CEO. The announcement sent shockwaves through the business world. People questioned whether I was making a mistake, whether I was leaving too soon, whether the company could continue to thrive without me. But I knew it was the right decision. Because legacy isn't about holding on to power. It's about building something that outlasts you. It's about creating a foundation strong enough that others can build upon it. It's about making sure the work continues long after you're gone. The transition year was bittersweet. I spent my days preparing Jasmine, introducing her to key stakeholders, ensuring she had everything she needed to succeed. I spent my evenings reflecting on the journey, on how far I had come, on everything I had built. On my last day as CEO, the company held a ceremony. Employees packed the auditorium, just as they had 14 years earlier when I had given my first speech as CEO. But this time the atmosphere was different. This time there were tears and applause and gratitude. Jasmine spoke first, thanking me for my mentorship and promising to uphold the values we had established. Daniel spoke next, talking about family and legacy and the importance of using power responsibly. And then it was my turn. I walked to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. Faces of people I had worked with for over a decade. People I had fought alongside. People who had believed in the vision we were building together. 14 years ago, I stood in front of you as a terrified 24-year-old who had no idea what she was doing. I began. I had been an intern for less than a year. I had no executive experience. I had no credentials. All I had was a belief that this company could be better. And you gave me a chance. You trusted me. You followed me. And together we built something extraordinary. I paused, emotion welling up in my throat. Sterling and Cross is no longer just a company. It's a movement. It's proof that business can be a force for good. It's proof that success and integrity can coexist. It's proof that when you invest in people, everyone wins. My voice grew stronger. But this isn't goodbye. I'm not leaving. I'm simply stepping into a new role. And I'm leaving the company in capable hands. Jasmine will take Sterling and Cross to heights I never imagined. And I'll be here to support her every step of the way. The applause was deafening. People stood cheering, some crying. I saw Linda Chen in the front row, tears streaming down her face. I saw Daniel, his hand over his heart. I saw employees I had hired, mentored, believed in. And I felt overwhelming gratitude. Gratitude for the journey. Gratitude for the opportunity. Gratitude for the chance to make a difference. After the ceremony, I cleaned out my office. I packed up the few personal items I kept there. Photo of my mother. The letter from Jonathan Sterling. The folder of documents from the SEC investigation. Reminders of where I had come from and what I had overcome. As I walked out of the CEO's office for the last time, I didn't feel sad. Felt free. Free from the weight of constant responsibility. Free from the pressure of always having to prove myself. Free to simply be Emily Harris, not Emily Harris the CEO. That evening I drove to the cemetery. I stood in front of my mother's grave as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I did it, Mom, I whispered. I built something that matters. I helped people, thousands of people, people just like you. People who needed someone to see them, to value them, to give them a chance. I knelt down and touched the headstone. I know you can't answer me. I know you're gone. But I feel you. Feel your strength. Feel your love. And I carry it with me every single day. I stayed there until the stars came out, until the cemetery was dark and quiet. And then I stood, took a deep breath and walked back to my car. My life at Sterling and Cross wasn't ending. It was simply evolving. I would still be chairman of the board. I would still oversee the foundation. I would still advocate for corporate accountability and ethical business practices. But I would also have time for other things. Time to travel. Time to write a book about my experiences. Time to mentor young people who were facing the same obstacles I once did. Time to simply live, without the constant pressure of running a multi-billion-dollar company. As I drove away from the cemetery, I thought about that day 14 years ago when I had stood in the boardroom and watched Robert Chen get arrested. I thought about the terrified young woman I had been, unsure if she could handle the responsibility being thrust upon her. And I realized something. I had been afraid back then that I wasn't enough. That I didn't deserve the position. That I would fail and prove everyone who doubted me right. But I had been enough. More than enough. I had taken a broken company and made it whole. I had helped thousands of people through the foundation. I had changed the conversation around corporate responsibility and ethical business practices. I had built a legacy that would outlast me. 3 months after stepping down as CEO, I received an email from a young woman named Sarah Chen. She was Robert and Linda's daughter, someone I had never met. The email was short but powerful. Dear Ms. Harris, my name is Sarah Chen. You don't know me, but you changed my life. When my father was arrested, my family lost everything. We lost our home, our reputation, our stability. I was 15 years old and I thought my life was over. But then my mother got a job at your foundation. And suddenly things got better. We had stability. We had hope. And I had an example of what it meant to be strong and resilient. The email continued. I'm writing because I just graduated from college with a degree in business ethics. And I'm writing because I want to dedicate my life to the same work you've done. Making sure companies are held accountable. Making sure people don't suffer because of corporate greed. Making sure what happened to my family never happens to anyone else. Thank you for giving my mother a second chance. Thank you for showing me that redemption is possible. And thank you for proving that one person really can make a difference. I sat at my desk, tears streaming down my face, and typed a response. Dear Sarah, thank you for your email. Means more than you know. Your mother is one of the strongest people I've ever met. And from your letter, I can tell you've inherited that strength. The world needs people like you. People who are willing to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. People who believe that business can be a force for good. If you ever want to talk about your career, about the work I've done, about anything at all, my door is always open. With admiration, Emily Harris. That exchange reminded me why I had done all of this. Not for recognition or wealth or power, but to create opportunities for people like Sarah. People who came from difficult circumstances but had the potential to do extraordinary things. People who just needed someone to believe in them. 6 months after stepping down as CEO, I published my memoir. I titled it, Invisible No More: How I Went from Unwanted Intern to CEO. The book detailed my entire journey, from growing up poor in Ohio to running Sterling and Cross. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I wrote about the pain, the struggles, the moments when I wanted to give up. But I also wrote about the victories, the allies I found, the lessons I learned. The book became a bestseller. It sparked conversations about corporate accountability, about class and opportunity, about the importance of diverse leadership. I received thousands of letters from readers who saw themselves in my story. From single mothers working multiple jobs. From children of immigrants fighting to succeed. From people who had been told they weren't good enough but refused to believe it. Each letter reminded me that my story wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. 1 year after stepping down as CEO, Sterling and Cross announced record profits. The employee ownership model was working. The foundation had helped over 100,000 people. Jasmine Rodriguez was being hailed as one of the most innovative CEOs in America, and I was free to pursue new challenges. I started a consulting firm, helping other companies implement ethical business practices. I joined the boards of several nonprofits. I spoke at conferences and universities around the world. And I continued to mentor young leaders, especially women and people from disadvantaged backgrounds. I told them what I wished someone had told me when I was starting out. Your background doesn't define your future. Your circumstances don't limit your potential. The people who underestimate you are wrong. And if you work hard, if you stay true to your values, if you refuse to give up, you can achieve extraordinary things. I told them about my mother, about her sacrifices, about the strength she showed every single day. I told them that they came from survivors, from fighters, from people who refused to be broken. And I told them that they had a responsibility to use their success to help others, to make sure the next generation didn't have to fight as hard as they did. 2 years after stepping down as CEO, I returned to Ohio State University. The school invited me to give the commencement address, the same school I had dropped out of 15 years earlier to take care of my mother. Standing on that stage, looking out at thousands of graduates in their caps and gowns, I felt a wave of emotion. I thought about the young woman I had been, sitting in the hospital with my dying mother, dropping out of school, feeling like her dreams were over. I thought about how wrong I had been. My dreams hadn't ended. They had simply changed shape. 15 years ago, I sat where you're sitting, I told the graduates. And then life intervened. Had to leave school. I had to take care of my mother. I had to let go of the future I had planned. Pause. But what I learned is that sometimes the detours become the destination. Sometimes the obstacles become the opportunities. Sometimes losing what you thought you wanted leads you to something better. I looked out at the sea of young faces. You're going to face setbacks. You're going to face rejection. You're going to face moments when you want to give up. But I'm asking you not to. I'm asking you to keep going. Keep fighting. To keep believing that you have something valuable to offer the world. My voice grew stronger. Because you do. Each and every one of you has the potential to make a difference. Change lives. To build something meaningful. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let anyone make you feel invisible. 'Cause you're not. You matter. And the world needs what you have to give. The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, the university president approached me. Ms. Harris, we'd like to offer you an honorary degree in recognition of your achievements and your contributions to business ethics. I accepted, tears in my eyes. The degree wasn't just for me. It was for my mother. For every person who had worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. For every person who had sacrificed their dreams for their children. For every person who had been told they didn't matter. 3 years after stepping down as CEO, I established the Susan Harris Institute for Ethical Leadership. It was a non-profit organization dedicated to training the next generation of ethical business leaders. The institute offered scholarships, mentorship programs, and leadership training to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. We partnered with universities around the country. We brought in speakers, held workshops, created curricula, and we made sure that the people who most needed access to these opportunities could get them, regardless of their ability to pay. The institute became my greatest pride. It was my mother's legacy, enshrined in an institution that would continue her work long after I was gone. Every student who graduated from the institute's programs carried a piece of my mother's strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief that hard work and integrity mattered. And they went out into the world and changed it. 4 years after stepping down as CEO, I received news that Robert Chen had been released from prison on early parole for good behavior. He had served 12 years of his 20-year sentence. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me was angry that he hadn't served his full sentence. Part of me believed in second chances, the same second chances I had given to Linda and countless others. A week after his release, Robert called me. His voice was tentative, uncertain. Ms. Harris, this is Robert Chen. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I was hoping we could meet. Just once. I have something I need to say to you in person. I hesitated, then agreed. We met at the same cafe where I had met with Margaret Sterling years earlier. Robert looked old, much older than his 67 years. Prison had aged him. But there was something different in his eyes. Something that looked like humility. "Thank you for meeting me," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." I didn't respond, just waited for him to continue. Robert took a deep breath. "I've spent the last 12 years thinking about what I did. About the people I hurt. About the damage I caused. And I've come to realize that I can never make it right. I can never undo the harm." He looked at me directly. "But I want you to know that what you've done with Sterling and Cross, what you've built, has given me hope. Hope that even when someone destroys something, someone else can rebuild it better than it was before." He pulled out a thin notebook. "I've been writing while I was in prison. Documenting everything I did, how I did it, why I did it. Not to excuse myself, but to help prevent it from happening again. I want to give this to your institute. I want future business leaders to learn from my mistakes." I took the notebook and flipped through it. Pages and pages of detailed confessions, explanations, warnings. "Why?" asked. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "Because I destroyed my life and hurt thousands of people. And if sharing my story can prevent even one person from making the same mistakes, then maybe my life wasn't completely wasted." I looked at this broken man sitting across from me. The man who had once been so arrogant, so certain of his own superiority. He had lost everything. His career, his freedom, his family, his reputation. And yet, he was trying to do something meaningful with what little he had left. "I'll accept this," I said finally. "And I'll use it at the Institute. But Robert, you need to understand something. This doesn't erase what you did. This doesn't make you a good person." Robert nodded. "I know. I'm not looking for redemption. I'm just looking for a way to be useful." We parted ways after that meeting. I never saw Robert Chen again. He moved to a small town in Montana, got a job as a bookkeeper for a local nonprofit, and lived quietly for the rest of his life. But his notebook became one of the most powerful teaching tools at the Susan Harris Institute. Students read it, dissected it, learned from it. They saw firsthand how good people could make terrible choices. How ambition could curdle into greed. How small compromises could lead to massive corruption. 5 years after stepping down as CEO, I celebrated my 40th birthday. It was a small celebration, just close friends and family. Daniel was there, along with his wife and 2 children. Linda Chen was there, now the executive director of the Sterling Foundation. Jasmine Rodriguez was there, having successfully led Sterling and Cross to 5 consecutive years of record growth. Margaret Sterling was there, now in her 70s but still sharp and engaged. And Sarah Chen was there, having just been hired as the general counsel for a major corporation where she was already making waves with her commitment to ethics and accountability. We gathered at a restaurant overlooking the city, the same city where Sterling and Cross headquarters stood, the same city where I had started my journey as an intern so many years ago. As we ate and laughed and told stories, I looked around the table at these people who had become my family. Not family by blood necessarily, but family by choice. Family forged through struggle and triumph, through pain and healing. And I realized something profound. I had spent the first part of my life feeling invisible, feeling unwanted. I had spent the second part proving that I mattered, that I was enough. But now, in this third phase, I was simply living. Not fighting. Not proving. Just being. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. That night, as I stood on my apartment balcony looking out at the city, I thought about the girl I used to be. The girl who was told she wasn't good enough. The girl whose own father had abandoned her. The girl who had watched her mother work herself to death. And I wished I could go back in time and tell her that everything would be okay. That the pain wouldn't last forever. That she would find her place in the world. That she would build something extraordinary. That she would be happy. But I couldn't go back. None of us can. All we can do is move forward, carrying our scars and our lessons, using our pain to fuel our purpose. And that's exactly what I did. I took the pain of being unwanted and used it to make sure other people felt valued. I took the struggle of poverty and used it to help people escape it. I took the betrayal of corporate corruption and used it to build something honest and ethical. I transformed my wounds into wisdom, my suffering into service, my invisibility into impact. 6 years after stepping down as CEO, I received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It was awarded for my contributions to business ethics, corporate accountability, and social justice. Standing in the White House, having the medal placed around my neck, I thought about my mother. About how she had never received recognition for her sacrifices. About how she had died without knowing that her daughter would achieve something this significant. But I believed, truly believed, that wherever she was, she knew. And she was proud. In my acceptance speech, I dedicated the medal to her. This honor isn't for me alone. It's for my mother, Susan Harris, who worked 3 jobs so I could have opportunities she never had. It's for every parent who sacrifices for their children. It's for every person who has been underestimated and overlooked. It's for everyone who refuses to accept that their circumstances define their destiny. I looked directly into the camera. If you're watching this and you feel invisible, if you feel like you don't matter, I want you to know something. You do matter. Your struggles matter. Your dreams matter. And if you keep fighting, if you refuse to give up, you can change not just your own life but the lives of everyone around you. That's what my mother taught me. That's what I've spent my life trying to prove. And that's what I hope this medal represents. 7 years after stepping down as CEO, I was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease. The doctors told me it was slow progressing, that I had years before it significantly impacted my quality of life. But the diagnosis was a wake-up call, a reminder that time was finite, that I needed to make sure my work would continue after I was gone. I spent the next year putting everything in order. I established trusts to fund the Sterling Foundation and the Susan Harris Institute in perpetuity. I wrote detailed instructions for the organizations I had built, ensuring they would continue to operate according to my values. I recorded video messages for key stakeholders, offering guidance and encouragement for the challenges they would face. And I wrote letters, hundreds of them, to the people who had helped me along the way, to the people I had mentored, to the people whose lives I had touched. In each letter I thanked them. I told them what they meant to me. I encouraged them to keep fighting for what was right. One of those letters went to Sarah Chen. Dear Sarah, by the time you read this, I'll probably be gone. The Alzheimer's will have progressed or something else will have happened. But I wanted you to know how proud I am of the woman you've become. You took the worst moment of your life and used it to fuel your purpose. You turned your father's mistakes into your mission. You proved that we are not defined by our parents' failures, but by our own choices. The letter continued. I'm leaving the Susan Harris Institute in capable hands, but I hope you'll consider joining the board someday. The Institute needs people like you. People who understand both the pain and the potential of second chances. Keep fighting, Sarah. Keep believing. Keep proving that one person really can make a difference. With love and admiration, Emily Harris. 8 years after stepping down as CEO, I attended my last board meeting at Sterling & Cross. My memory was starting to fade. I had trouble remembering names sometimes, lost track of conversations, repeated myself. But I was still coherent enough to participate, still capable enough to offer guidance. At the end of the meeting, Jasmine Rodriguez stood up. Before we adjourn, I have an announcement. The board has voted unanimously to rename the Sterling & Cross headquarters building. Effective immediately, it will be known as the Susan Harris Building. I stared at her, unable to process what she had just said. Jasmine smiled. Your mother sacrificed everything so you could succeed. She worked 3 jobs, she gave up her dreams, she literally worked herself to death to give you opportunities. And because of her, you built something extraordinary. It's only fitting that her name be on the building. Tears streamed down my face. I couldn't speak. Everyone in the room stood and applauded. And I felt my mother's presence, stronger than I had in years. She was there with me. Proud. Peace. Complete. 9 years after stepping down as CEO, I moved into a memory care facility. The Alzheimer's had progressed to the point where I could no longer live independently. Daniel had wanted me to move in with him, but I refused. I didn't want to be a burden. The facility was nice, comfortable. I had my own room with a window overlooking a garden. I had photos on the walls, photos of my mother, of the Sterling and Cross building, of the foundation's work, of all the people I had helped over the years. On good days I could still remember everything clearly. I could still talk about the company, about the foundation, about my mother. On bad days I wasn't sure where I was or why I was there. But even on the bad days I remembered one thing. I remembered that I mattered. That my life had meaning. That I had made a difference. Visitors came regularly. Daniel came every week with his family. Linda Chen came monthly, bringing news from the foundation. Jasmine Rodriguez came occasionally, updating me on Sterling and Cross. And Sarah Chen came often, sitting with me, holding my hand, telling me about her work fighting corporate corruption. One afternoon, about 10 years after I had stepped down as CEO, Sarah visited with news. "Emily, I have something to tell you. I've just been appointed as the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission's Division of Enforcement. I'm going to be going after corrupt executives, just like you went after my father." I smiled, though I wasn't entirely sure who she was talking about. My memory was foggy that day. But I understood the essence of what she was saying. "That's good," I said. "People need to be held accountable." Sarah squeezed my hand. "You taught me that. You showed me that it's possible to stand up to powerful people, to demand integrity, to make them pay for their crimes." She leaned closer. "Everything I am, everything I've accomplished, is because you gave my mother a second chance. Because you showed me that redemption is possible." I looked at this young woman sitting beside me. I didn't remember all the details of our connection, but I felt it. I felt the bond, the shared purpose, the continuation of something I had started. "Keep going," I whispered. "Don't let them win." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I won't. I promise." That was the last coherent conversation I had. After that, my memory declined rapidly. Within months, I barely recognized visitors. Within a year, I barely recognized myself. But even as my mind faded, even as I forgot names and faces and stories, I held on to one thing. Feeling. Sense of peace. A knowledge, deep in my bones, that my life had mattered. 12 years after stepping down as CEO, I died peacefully in my sleep. I was 48 years old. The funeral was held at a cathedral in New York City. Thousands of people attended. Employees from Sterling and Cross. People helped by the foundation. Students from the Susan Harris Institute. Business leaders. Politicians. Activists. People I had never met who had been inspired by my story. Daniel delivered the eulogy. He talked about our shared father, about the choices Jonathan Sterling had made, about the pain those choices caused. But he also talked about redemption, about how I had taken that pain and transformed it into something beautiful. "My sister spent her entire life proving that she mattered," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "She proved it to our father, who abandoned her. She proved it to the Sterling family, who rejected her. She proved it to the business world, which underestimated her. But most importantly, she proved it to herself." He looked out at the crowded cathedral. Emily Harris was invisible for the first part of her life. But she made herself seen. She made herself heard. She made herself undeniable. And in doing so, she changed the world. After Daniel, Linda Chen spoke. She talked about how I had given her a second chance when everyone else had written her off. She talked about the foundation, about the 150,000 people we had helped over the years. "Emily never forgot where she came from," Linda said. "She never forgot what it was like to struggle. And she spent every day of her adult life making sure other people didn't have to struggle the way she did." Jasmine Rodriguez spoke next. She talked about the company, about how Sterling and Cross had become a model for ethical business practices, about how other companies were following our lead. "Emily Harris proved that you don't have to choose between profit and principle," Jasmine said. She proved that companies can be both successful and good. She changed the entire conversation around corporate responsibility. And finally Saracen spoke. She was now 40 years old, a powerful figure in the business world, feared by corrupt executives and admired by honest ones. "Emily Harris saved my family," Sarah said simply. "She could have destroyed us. She had every reason to. My father stole from her company. He lied. He betrayed everyone. But Emily chose compassion over vengeance. She gave my mother a job when no one else would. She mentored me when I had nothing. She showed me that your past doesn't define your future." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "And now I spend every day fighting the same battles she fought. Going after corrupt executives. Holding powerful people accountable. Making sure companies operate ethically. Everything I do in her honor." She looked at my coffin. "Rest in peace, Emily. You fought the good fight. You made the world better. And your legacy will live on through all of us." They buried me next to my mother in the cemetery in Millbrook, Ohio. The headstone was simple, just my name and dates and a single inscription. She was invisible no more. In the years after my death, the Susan Harris Institute continued to grow, trained thousands of ethical business leaders, partnered with companies around the world. It became the gold standard for corporate responsibility education. The Sterling Foundation continued its work, eventually helping over 1 million people. The employee ownership model at Sterling and Cross became standard practice at hundreds of companies. Laws were passed mandating greater corporate accountability. Executives faced real consequences for fraud and corruption. And slowly, gradually, the business world began to change. Not completely. Not perfectly. There were still greedy executives and corrupt companies. But there were also more Emily Harrises. More people willing to speak up. More people demanding integrity. More people refusing to accept that profit justified any means. 20 years after my death, Fortune magazine published a retrospective on my life. They called me the CEO who changed corporate America. They detailed my journey from unwanted infant to intern to CEO. They analyzed the impact of my policies and programs. They interviewed people whose lives I had touched. The article concluded with a simple statement. Emily Harris proved that one person, armed with courage and integrity, can change the world. She started with nothing and built an empire of ethics. She was underestimated by everyone and proved them all wrong. She transformed pain into purpose and invisibility into impact. Her legacy will endure for generations. And it did. 30 years after my death, business schools taught case studies about Sterling and Cross and the Harris transformation, as it came to be known. 50 years after my death, the Susan Harris Institute had trained over 100,000 ethical business leaders. 100 years after my death, the world had changed. Not completely but significantly. Corporate fraud was rarer. Executive accountability was stronger. Employee ownership was common. The gap between rich and poor had narrowed. And it was all because one woman refused to stay invisible. One woman who was told she didn't matter decided to prove otherwise. One woman who took her pain and turned it into power. My name was Emily Harris. I was the daughter of a waitress who worked 3 jobs and a wealthy man who abandoned me. I was overweight and poor and overlooked. I was everything the world said wasn't enough. But I became CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I helped over 1 million people through my foundation. I trained hundreds of thousands of ethical leaders. I changed corporate America. I proved that invisible people can become undeniable. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the money or the power or the recognition, but the fact that I existed, that I mattered, that I made a difference, that I was seen. I was invisible no more.